I still remember the exact moment my career died. Or, at least, that's what everyone in that conference room thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the fluorescent lights make everything look washed out and lifeless, and the air conditioning hums just loud enough to make you feel slightly disconnected from reality. I was standing at the front of the room, presenting a project I'd poured 3 months of my life into. Every slide had been scrutinized, every data point verified, every recommendation carefully crafted. This was supposed to be my moment, the presentation that would prove I was ready for the next level. My boss, Richard, sat in the back with his arms crossed, that smug little smile playing on his lips like he knew something I didn't. I should have known something was coming. Richard always had this way of letting you think you were doing well right before he pulled the rug out from under you. When I finished, there was this awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Then Richard stood up, slowly, deliberately, like he was about to deliver a sermon from a pulpit. He looked around the room at my colleagues, making eye contact with each of them, building anticipation. Then he looked back at me, and he said it. Those words that would burn into my brain for the next year, that would replay in my head during every moment of doubt, every sleepless night, every time I questioned whether I was making the right choice. "You'll never make it without me." He let it hang there for a second, watching the words land, watching me absorb the blow. Then he continued, his voice dripping with a paternal condescension that made my skin crawl. "I mean, look at this presentation. It's amateur hour. The analysis is surface level at best. You don't have the instincts for this business. You're good at following directions, sure, I'll give you that. You can execute what someone else envisions. But leadership? Vision? Strategic thinking? That's not you. That's just not in your DNA. Without my guidance, without my oversight, you'd be completely lost." The room was silent. Dead silent. I felt my face burning, that horrible prickly heat that starts at your neck and spreads upward. My hands were shaking, so I gripped my notes tighter, the paper crinkling audibly in the quiet room. Some people looked down at their phones, suddenly finding urgent messages. Others just stared at the table in front of them, unwilling to meet my eyes. No one defended me. No one said a word. No one even looked uncomfortable with what was happening. Richard walked past me, patted my shoulder like I was a child who'd just struck out at Little League, and said quietly, just loud enough for the people nearest to hear, "Maybe you should stick to what you're good at. There's no shame in being a solid number 2. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was tight, and if I'd opened my mouth, I think I would have either screamed or cried, and I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of either. So I just stood there, nodded slightly like I was accepting his feedback, and gathered my papers with trembling hands. I walked out of that conference room feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire professional life. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, still wearing my work clothes, not even bothering to turn on more than one lamp. The city lights filtered through my window, casting long shadows across the room. I kept replaying the scene over and over, unable to stop the loop in my mind. The condescension in his voice. The way he'd made me feel small in front of everyone I worked with, everyone whose respect I'd been trying to earn for years. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that was bad enough. It was the tiny voice in the back of my head whispering, "What if he's right? What if you really don't have what it takes?" I'd worked under Richard for 4 years. He'd taught me a lot, sure, but he'd also made sure I knew my place in the hierarchy. Every achievement I had was somehow redirected to his leadership, his vision, his guidance. Every mistake was mine alone, evidence of my limitations, proof that I still had so much to learn. He had this way of making you feel grateful just to be in his presence, like he was doing you this enormous favor by letting you exist in his orbit, by sharing his wisdom with someone as obviously limited as you. But that night, sitting there in the semi-darkness, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a sudden explosion of motivation, like you see in movies. It was quieter than that, more fundamental. I made myself a promise. Not a loud, dramatic one where I swore vengeance or made grand declarations. Just a quiet decision in the privacy of my own thoughts, a decision that felt like it was changing the molecular structure of who I was. I would prove him wrong. Not by arguing, not by making a scene, not by trying to defend myself or change his mind about me, but by building something he could never take credit for, something so undeniably mine that no one could attribute it to his guidance or mentorship. Something that would make his words echo back at him in the most ironic way possible. I had no idea how I was going to do it. I had no plan, no connections outside the company, no safety net. I just knew I had to try because the alternative was accepting his version of reality, and I couldn't live with that. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened. I smiled at people in the hallway, I nodded in meetings, I did my job with the same competence I always had. But internally, everything had changed. It was like I was operating on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, I was the same employee I'd always been, maybe even more compliant, more agreeable. But underneath, I was planning, preparing, transforming. I started waking up at 5 a.m. to learn. Not just casual reading, but intensive, structured learning. Marketing strategies, financial modeling, business development, negotiation tactics, industry trends, competitive analysis. I consumed everything I could find. Podcasts on my commute, where I'd hear successful founders talk about their failures and breakthroughs. Online courses after work, sometimes staying up until midnight to finish modules on financial statements or digital marketing or strategic planning. Books stacked on my nightstand, highlighting and taking notes, treating my education like it was a second full-time job. I was exhausted constantly, running on coffee and determination, but I was also awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Before, I'd been sleepwalking through my career, letting Richard define what success looked like, what I was capable of, what my trajectory should be. Now I was defining it for myself. At work, I kept my head down. I didn't challenge Richard anymore, didn't try to prove myself in meetings, didn't compete for recognition. I let him take credit, let him feel superior, let him think his assessment of me was accurate. But I was watching, learning, taking mental notes on what worked and what didn't. I started seeing the business differently, with fresh eyes. I noticed inefficiencies he ignored because they didn't affect his department directly. I saw opportunities he dismissed because they seemed too small or too risky. I observed how he treated clients, how he motivated his team, and I cataloged what I'd do differently if I ever had the chance. I began reaching out to people in the industry quietly, carefully building relationships outside my company. Coffee meetings before work with former colleagues who'd moved on. Lunches with people I met at industry events. Networking gatherings I would have been too tired to attend before, forcing myself to show up even when I wanted nothing more than to go home and sleep. I told myself every connection mattered, even if I didn't know how yet, even if most conversations led nowhere. Some people were genuinely helpful, offering advice or introductions. Most were polite but ultimately dismissive, clearly wondering what this mid-level employee could possibly offer them. A few were outright condescending, checking their watches during our conversations, looking past me for someone more important to talk to. But I kept going. I kept showing up, kept reaching out, kept building relationships one conversation at a time. 3 months after the incident, I pitched an idea to a potential client I'd met at a conference. It was a small consulting project, something I could handle independently as a side gig without it interfering with my day job. Just some market analysis and strategic recommendations for a small business trying to expand into a new region. They said yes. The contract was modest, barely enough to cover the hours I'd put in, but it was mine. I'd earned it without Richard's name attached, without his company's reputation backing me up, without any of the infrastructure I'd relied on for years. That small win felt bigger than any promotion I'd ever gotten, any bonus, any recognition. Because it was proof. Proof that I could do this independently, that clients would trust me based on my own merit, that maybe Richard's assessment of my abilities wasn't the objective truth I'd feared it might be. I set up a simple LLC, nothing fancy, just the legal structure I needed to operate. I built a basic website over a weekend, nothing impressive but professional enough. And I started taking on more projects, one at a time, squeezing them into early mornings and late nights and weekends. Each one was a learning experience. Some went well, and I'd feel this surge of confidence that maybe I really could do this. Others were disasters, where I'd underestimate the scope or struggle with aspects I hadn't mastered yet, and I'd lie awake wondering if Richard had been right all along. 6 months in, I was running on fumes, barely holding myself together. I'd wake up exhausted, my alarm going off at 5 feeling like violence, and I'd drag myself through my day job on autopilot, counting the hours until I could get home and work on my actual future. Then I'd work on my side projects until 1 or 2 in the morning, sometimes later, fueled by coffee and the fear that if I slowed down, I'd lose momentum and never get it back. I was taking on small consulting gigs whenever I could find them, building a portfolio of work, slowly accumulating testimonials and case studies. But it was slow. Painfully, frustratingly slow. The progress was incremental, almost invisible day to day. There were nights when I'd sit at my laptop, staring at a proposal that went nowhere, an email that got no response, a pitch that fell flat, and think, maybe he was right. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe I'm delusional for even trying this. I remember one particularly brutal week that almost broke me completely. I'd lost 2 potential clients in a row, both of whom decided to go with more established consultants with bigger names and longer track records. One of them didn't even bother to send a rejection email, just ghosted me after weeks of conversations. My savings were dwindling because I was investing everything into courses, tools, software subscriptions, and travel for networking events. My credit card balance was climbing. I was barely sleeping, barely eating properly, running myself into the ground. At work, Richard had just gotten promoted to vice president, and he made sure everyone knew it. He gave this speech at the company all-hands meeting about vision and leadership, about the qualities that separate true leaders from capable followers, and I swear he looked right at me when he talked about how some people are meant to follow, not lead, and how there was dignity in knowing your lane and staying in it. I almost quit everything that night. I almost sent an email to my side clients saying I was done, that I couldn't do it anymore, that I needed to focus on my day job and stop chasing this impossible dream. I had the email drafted, my finger hovering over the send button. But I didn't send it. Instead, I called my older sister, the one person who'd always been straight with me, who'd never sugar-coated anything. She listened to me vent for an hour, let me spill out all my doubts and fears and frustrations without interrupting. Then she said something simple, something that sounds almost stupid in its simplicity but somehow cut through all the noise. You've already come further than you think. Don't let one asshole define your ceiling. That was it. No grand wisdom, no complex strategy, just a reminder that I'd already proven I could do hard things. That I'd already built something from nothing, even if it wasn't where I wanted it to be yet. So, I kept going. I didn't send that email. I deleted it, closed my laptop, and went to bed. The next morning, I got up at 5 and started again. The turning point came in month 9, though I didn't recognize it immediately. I was at a small business conference, one of those mid-tier events where you pay too much money to eat rubber chicken and sit through panel discussions that range from genuinely insightful to completely useless. I'd learned to work these events efficiently by then, targeting specific people I wanted to meet, having my elevator pitch down to a science, knowing when to cut conversations short and when to dig deeper. During an afternoon break, I struck up a conversation with a guy named Marcus who was standing alone by the coffee station. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with gray hair and casual clothes that stood out in a sea of business suits. He didn't seem like the typical corporate type, didn't have that aggressive networking energy that most people at these events radiate. We started talking about the industry, and I mentioned some of the inefficiencies I'd noticed in how mid-sized companies handled client acquisition and retention. Not in a pitchy way, just genuine conversation about the problems I'd been observing and thinking about. He listened intently, asked smart questions, challenged some of my assumptions in a way that made me think harder rather than feel defensive. At the end of our conversation, which had gone on much longer than I'd planned, he handed me his card. I glanced at it and felt my stomach drop slightly. Marcus Chun, managing partner at Vertex Capital. Turns out Marcus was a venture capitalist who specialized in acquiring and restructuring underperforming companies in our industry. He told me to send him my thoughts in more detail, that he was always looking for people who saw things others missed. I almost didn't follow up. The imposter syndrome hit hard. Who was I to send business strategy to a venture capitalist? I was still working a regular job, still grinding away on small consulting projects that barely paid my rent. What could I possibly offer someone at his level? But I'd promised myself I'd take every shot, no matter how unlikely, so I spent the next week crafting the most detailed analysis I'd ever written. I outlined the structural problems I'd observed in mid-sized consulting firms, the reasons they stagnated, the opportunities they consistently missed. I included specific examples, data I'd collected, strategies I'd been developing. I must have rewritten it 20 times, second-guessing every sentence. Finally, I just sent it, figuring the worst that could happen was nothing, which was what I already had. 3 days later, Marcus called me personally. He wanted to meet in person, have a longer conversation. My heart was pounding when I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in downtown, nothing fancy, and Marcus got straight to the point. He was looking at acquiring a mid-sized consulting firm in our industry, one that had great fundamentals, but terrible management and leadership. The company had good clients, talented people, decent reputation, but it was stagnant, losing market share, suffering from internal politics and outdated practices. He needed someone who understood the operational side intimately, someone hungry enough to put in the brutal work of turning it around, someone who could connect with the existing team and help rebuild the culture. He asked if I'd be interested in coming on not as an employee, not as a hired gun, but as a partner. He'd handle the acquisition and financing, but I'd have equity, real ownership, a seat at the table for all major decisions. I almost choked on my coffee. My mind was racing. This was insane. I was nobody. I was still working for Richard, still grinding away in obscurity. Why would someone like Marcus want to partner with me? I asked him directly, needed to understand what he saw that I couldn't see in myself. He said, because you see what others miss, and you're willing to do the work. Most people at your level of experience are either too arrogant to learn or too beaten down to try. You're neither. You've built something from nothing while working a full-time job, which tells me you're resourceful and driven. And your analysis showed me you understand this business at a level that most consultants with twice your experience don't. That's the kind of person I invest in. We talked for 3 hours. He laid out his vision, asked about mine, probed my thinking on dozens of operational questions. By the end, we shook hands on exploring this further. The next 2 months were a blur of due diligence meetings, legal documents, financial projections, and planning sessions. I had to do all of this in secret, obviously. I couldn't tell anyone at work what I was preparing for. So I kept showing up every day, kept doing my job, kept letting Richard treat me like I was lucky to be there, like I should be grateful for his continued tolerance of my limitations. It was surreal, like living in 2 completely separate realities at once. In one reality, I was the same mid-level employee I'd always been, executing tasks and attending meetings. In the other reality, I was about to become a partner in a firm that would compete directly with my current employer. The deal closed on a Friday in late afternoon. Marcus and I signed the final documents, and just like that, I was a business owner. I owned 25% of a company with over 100 employees and millions in annual revenue. It didn't feel real. That weekend, I barely slept, my mind spinning with everything that needed to happen, all the ways this could go wrong, the magnitude of what I'd just committed to. By Monday morning, I'd written and rewritten my resignation letter a dozen times. I wanted it to be professional, gracious even, giving no indication of where I was going or what I'd be doing. When I walked into the office that Monday, I felt like I was moving through a dream. I submitted my letter to HR first, then went to tell Richard in person. He called me into his office, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Where are you going?" he asked, not even pretending to care beyond basic curiosity. I kept it vague. Said I was pursuing another opportunity, that I appreciated everything I'd learned working for him, all the standard professional pleasantries. He leaned back in his chair, that familiar condescending smile returning to his face like an old friend. "Let me guess," he said. "Some small firm that promised you the world? Made you feel special? Offered you a fancy title?" I didn't respond, just let him talk. "You'll be back," he continued. "They always come back. You're not ready for anything bigger than this. You still have too much to learn, and without someone to guide you, you're going to make mistakes that'll cost you. You're making a mistake, but you're too stubborn to see it. I give it 6 months before you realize you need structure, need leadership, need someone who actually knows what they're doing. I just nodded, thanked him again for his time, and walked out. 2 weeks later, after I'd wrapped up my projects and transitioned my responsibilities, I was gone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't announce it on LinkedIn. I just disappeared from their world completely. The company Marcus and I acquired was called Castellan Group. It was a consulting firm that had been around for 15 years, with about 120 employees spread across 3 offices. They had some impressive clients on their roster, decent brand recognition in certain niches, but the growth had flatlined 5 years ago and had actually declined slightly in the past 2 years. The previous leadership had run it into the ground with poor strategic decisions, favoritism, internal politics, and a complete failure to adapt to changing market conditions. Morale was terrible. Turnover was high. The best people were quietly looking for exits. It took us 6 months of absolutely brutal work to even stabilize the situation, let alone turn it around. We had to restructure entire teams, removing some people who'd been there for years but were toxic to the culture, promoting others who'd been overlooked, bringing in new talent. We rebuilt client relationships that had been neglected or damaged, having honest conversations about where things had gone wrong and how we were going to fix them. We changed processes, updated technology, rewrote how we approached projects. I worked harder than I ever had in my life, regularly pulling 14 or 16-hour days, flying between offices, sitting in on client meetings, reviewing proposals, coaching team members. But this time it was different. This time, every hour I worked was building something I owned, something that would grow in value if we succeeded. I had equity. I had authority to make real decisions. I had a partner in Marcus who trusted my vision and gave me room to execute it. And slowly, gradually, we started winning. We landed new clients, first small ones, then bigger ones. We started getting referrals, always the best sign that you're doing things right. Word of mouth began spreading in the industry. Our best people stopped looking for exits and started recruiting their talented friends to join us. By month 8, we doubled our monthly revenue compared to when we took over. By month 10, we'd made our first acquisition, buying a smaller firm that complemented our capabilities. By month 12, we were being noticed in the industry. Publications were writing about our turnaround. Competitors were paying attention. And that's when things got interesting in a way I could never have anticipated. Castellan Group started getting attention from bigger players in the industry. We were invited to pitch for major contracts, the kind that would have been completely out of reach a year earlier. We were brought into partnership discussions with firms that previously wouldn't have returned our calls. Our growth trajectory was steep enough that people wanted to understand what we were doing differently. One day, about 13 months after I'd left my old company, Marcus forwarded me an email with a subject line that made my stomach drop and my heart race simultaneously. It was from my old company, from their business development team. They wanted to explore a potential partnership with Castellan Group. They'd heard about our growth, seen our recent press coverage, and thought there might be synergies worth exploring. They proposed a meeting to discuss how our firms might collaborate on larger projects. The email was signed by Richard, who'd apparently taken on additional business development responsibilities with his VP role. I stared at that email for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to process what I was feeling. It was this complex mixture of vindication and anger and nervousness and excitement. Marcus came into my office, saw my face, and asked what was wrong. I showed him the email. He read it, looked up at me with this slight smile, and asked what I wanted to do. I could have ignored it, could have had someone else handle it, could have declined professionally and moved on. But I didn't want to do any of those things. I wanted to take the meeting. I needed to take the meeting. Not for revenge, exactly, but for closure, for completion, for the final chapter of the story that had started in that conference room 13 months ago. So I replied to the email personally, expressing interest in exploring collaboration, and I set up a meeting at our offices for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks felt impossibly long and impossibly short at the same time. I kept second-guessing the decision. Was this petty? Was I doing this for the wrong reasons? But I also knew I needed to face this, needed to close this loop. When the day finally came, I made sure everything was perfect. Our conference room was prepared, Our team was briefed. Our materials were polished. I wore my best suit, the one I'd bought specifically for important client meetings, the one that made me feel competent and professional, and nothing like the person Richard had dismissed. Richard arrived with 3 members of his team. I watched from my office as they entered the building, as our receptionist greeted them, as they were led to the conference room. Richard didn't recognize the space at first. Why would he? He had no idea I was involved with Castellan. I'd kept my name out of the press coverage, preferring to let Marcus be the public face while I focused on operations. His team sat on one side of the table. Marcus and I entered from the other door and sat across from them. I'll never forget the moment Richard looked up and saw me. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened slightly, and his face went through this rapid sequence of expressions. Confusion, trying to place why I looked familiar in this unexpected context. Recognition, realizing exactly who I was. Shock, understanding that I was somehow involved with this company. And then something else, something that looked almost like fear, as he started calculating what this meant. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and professional, none of the trembling that had been there 13 months ago. "Thanks for coming in. I'm one of the partners here at Castellan Group. I believe you wanted to discuss a potential collaboration." The meeting was professional. Painfully, meticulously professional. Richard tried to recover, tried to act like this was completely normal, just another business meeting. But I could see his hands shaking slightly when he opened his folder, could see the tension in his jaw, could practically hear the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how to handle this situation. His team presented their pitch, outlining how our firms might work together on larger enterprise projects that neither could handle alone. It was competent, nothing special, the kind of standard partnership proposal that gets made in this industry all the time. When they finished, I asked questions. Pointed, analytical questions about their operational capabilities, their client satisfaction metrics, their team retention rates, their growth trajectory. The same kind of questions Richard used to ask me to expose my limitations, to make me feel small and underprepared. Except now, he was the one stumbling through answers, the one whose company was stagnant while mine was growing, the one who needed this partnership more than I did. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't mock him or throw his words back in his face. I didn't need to. The power dynamic had simply reversed, and everyone in that room could feel it. The reality was that his company was struggling. They'd lost several major clients in the past year. Their best people were leaving. The market was passing them by, and they knew it. Meanwhile, Castellan was thriving, growing, innovating. We asked clarifying questions, took notes, and maintained perfect professional courtesy throughout. At the end of the meeting, I thanked them for their time and their proposal. I said we'd review it carefully with our team and get back to them within 2 weeks with our decision. It was the same kind of non-committal professional response that companies give when they're not particularly interested but want to maintain the relationship. As they were packing up to leave, Richard lingered behind while his team headed toward the exit. He approached me slowly, and for a long moment, he just stood there looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I didn't know you were here," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, wasn't an acknowledgement of what he'd said to me, but there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Uncertainty, maybe. Or respect. Or just the discomfort of having reality completely contradict your assumptions. "I know," I replied. He seemed like he wanted to say something else, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify his past behavior, maybe to explain that he'd just been trying to help me understand my limitations. But what could he possibly say? How do you apologize for fundamentally underestimating someone? How do you explain away cruelty that you genuinely believed was truth? He opened his mouth, closed it again, then just nodded and left. We didn't end up partnering with his company. After reviewing their proposal with our team, the consensus was that it wasn't strong enough, that they didn't bring enough to the table to justify the complexity and risk of a formal partnership. More importantly, we had better options. We were in conversations with 3 other firms that were stronger, more innovative, more aligned with where we wanted to go. But that wasn't really the point. The point wasn't revenge, wasn't about making Richard feel bad or proving something to him specifically. The point was that moment of recognition, that reversal of positions, that silent acknowledgement that everything he'd said about me had been wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally completely wrong. A few months later, I heard through industry contacts that Richard's company was going through significant struggles. Budget cuts, layoffs, entire departments being restructured. Richard himself had been quietly moved to a less prominent role, no longer VP, back to managing a smaller team. The company was looking for buyers, trying to find someone to acquire them before things got worse. Meanwhile, Castellan continued to grow. We brought on new partners, expanded into new markets, opened an office in another city. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving, building something sustainable and real and valuable. I've thought a lot about that day in the conference room 13 months earlier when Richard told me I'd never make it without him. The truth is, he was partially right about one thing and completely wrong about everything else. He was right that I wasn't ready in that specific moment. I didn't have all the skills I needed, didn't have the confidence, didn't have the network or the experience or the track record. Those were real limitations, not imagined ones. But what he got completely, fundamentally wrong was thinking that those limitations were permanent, that they defined my potential, that I couldn't grow beyond who I was in that moment. He assessed me like I was a finished product rather than a work in progress. He looked at a snapshot and assumed it was the whole movie. The real lesson wasn't about revenge or proving people wrong. It was about belief. Belief that you can learn what you don't know. Belief that you can build what doesn't exist yet. Belief that one person's assessment of your potential isn't your destiny, isn't even necessarily accurate. Belief that growth is possible if you're willing to do the uncomfortable work that nobody sees. Would I have pushed myself this hard if Richard hadn't humiliated me that day? Honestly, probably not. I might have stayed comfortable, stayed in my lane, accepted his definition of what I was capable of. In a weird way, his cruelty became fuel. It gave me something to push against, a clear before and after marker in my life.
But I need to be clear about something.
I didn't succeed because of him. I didn't succeed because he motivated me or taught me some harsh truth I needed to hear. I succeeded despite him, and more importantly, I succeeded because I decided I was worth the effort, worth the investment, worth the risk. The decision to bet on myself, to put in the work when no one was watching, to keep going when it would have been easier to quit, that was mine. The growth, the learning, the relationships, the resilience I built, that was mine. Richard was just the catalyst, the inciting incident, but he wasn't the author of what came next. If you're reading this and you've ever had someone tell you that you're not good enough, that you'll never make it, that you should just accept your place and stop reaching for more, I want you to know something important. They're wrong. Not because you're perfect, not because you have no limitations, not because success is guaranteed or easy, but because growth is possible. You're not a static entity. You're not a finished product. You're a person capable of learning and changing and becoming something you can't even imagine right now. That person who doubted you, who dismissed you, who told you that you weren't enough, they're making a prediction based on who you are in this single moment. But they have absolutely no idea who you can become. They don't know what you're capable of learning. They don't know how hard you're willing to work. They don't know what's going to click for you 6 months or a year or 5 years from now. They're looking at a single frame and pretending they can see the whole film. The year after Richard told me I'd never make it without him, I didn't just prove him wrong. I became someone I didn't even know I could be. Not because I was special or naturally gifted or lucky, though luck certainly played a role, but because I refused to accept his version of my story. I refused to let his assessment become my ceiling. I decided that his words were a challenge, not a truth, and I spent every day working to make that challenge look ridiculous in hindsight. So here's what I learned. What I'd tell anyone in a similar situation. First, write down the moment someone made you feel small. Remember exactly how it felt, the specific words they used, the look on their face, the silence afterward. Don't bury it or try to forget it. Hold on to it. Not as a wound, but as evidence. Evidence that you were here, that you started here, that this is the before picture. Then use it. Let it make you angry enough to start, disciplined enough to continue, and humble enough to learn from everyone and everything around you. Angry because the situation is unfair and you deserve better. Disciplined because anger alone burns out quickly, and you need something more sustainable to keep going when it gets hard. Humble because you actually do have things to learn, skills to build, experiences to accumulate, and pretending otherwise will just slow you down. Success isn't about being naturally gifted or having everything figured out from the beginning. It's about being too stubborn to quit and too curious to stop learning. It's about taking every dismissive comment, every closed door, every condescending pat on the shoulder, and turning it into evidence that you're just getting started, that they haven't seen anything yet. Richard thought he was stating an objective fact when he said I'd never make it without him. He genuinely believed it. It wasn't malicious from his perspective, it was just obvious reality, like saying water is wet or the sky is blue. What he actually did was issue a challenge. And I spent the next year collecting receipts, building evidence, becoming someone who made his assessment look ridiculous. The greatest gift you can give yourself isn't proving someone wrong. It's becoming so focused on your own growth, so committed to your own development, so engaged with becoming the best version of yourself that their opinion becomes completely irrelevant. It's not that you proved them wrong. It's that you grew so far beyond the person they assessed that their judgment no longer applies. You became someone different, someone they never met, someone they couldn't have predicted. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or counted out or told that you weren't enough, do me a favor. Share this with someone who needs to hear it right now. Someone who's sitting in their apartment doubting themselves. Someone who just had their own Richard moment and isn't sure if they should keep fighting or just accept the assessment. Someone who needs a reminder that their story isn't over yet, that this chapter of doubt and struggle is just one chapter, not the whole book. Your share might be exactly what they need to keep going for one more day, and sometimes one more day is all you need to find the breakthrough. And if you want more stories about turning setbacks into comebacks, about the messy, unglamorous, unsexy work that happens between rock bottom and breakthrough, about real people building real things despite the odds, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This isn't just content for entertainment. This is a community of people who refuse to let someone else write the ending to their story. People who understand that growth is possible, that change is real, that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. Drop a comment and tell me about your moment. The specific time someone doubted you, dismissed you, or told you that you weren't enough. Because I can guarantee you're not alone. I can guarantee there are thousands of people reading this who've heard some version of what I heard, who felt that same burning shame and doubt. And I can guarantee that your comeback story is closer than you think, that you're building it right now even if you can't see it yet, that every small step you're taking is adding up to something bigger. Thanks for reading this whole thing, for sticking with me through this entire journey. And remember, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming so focused on your own path, so committed to your own growth, so engaged with building something meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. It's not about them anymore. It's about you and who you're becoming. Now get out there and build something they never saw coming, something they couldn't have imagined.